Welcome to Art Toronto 2014, and thanks for coming. My name is David Balzer. I'm the Associate Editor at Canadian Art Magazine, and we are presenting this talk called The Curated Market. So we now live in a time of the curated. Inside the art world, we look outside ourselves at users of social media sites like Twitter and Pinterest, at people who call themselves curators. We think it's funny, odd, strange, irritating. We know the curatorial well, we think, as art professionals. So how are these amateurs allowed to go by this name? How can you really curate a Twitter feed? In point of fact, amateur curation is effectively a redundancy, at least as regards the contemporary curator. To date, no star or power curator, Hans Ulrich Obrist, Klaus Biesenbach, Carolyn Christoph Bakarjiev, and many others, none of them have had what we would think of as a professional training in their field, even though more people than ever before are emerging from new or newish curatorial studies programs in schools. But just as this happens, just as degrees are springing up, appearing to grant people expertise in contemporary curating, curating is again fanning out to privilege the amateur. The art world does not, indeed, have to look outside itself to see this. It's happening right under our noses. A recent article in the Wall Street Journal underlined, as I do in my new book called Curationism, How Curating Took Over the Art World and Everything Else, that large institutions are handing curatorial work over to their audiences and viewers. Now rampant is crowdsourced curation, which some might see as the antithesis of the curatorial, with its traditional denotation of an individual connoisseur selecting certain things as an expression of taste and an impartation of value. Nonetheless, crowdsourced curation exists. In 2013, for example, Like It opened at the Essel Museum in Klosterneuburg, Austria, in which works from the museum's permanent collection were selected for an exhibition via Facebook likes. Social media, in our time, the largest expression of crowdsourced curation has infiltrated art institutions, with institutions from the AGO to the MoMA embracing interactivity and feedback, in some cases really encouraging attendees to pull out their smartphones when just a few years ago this was deeply verboten. The Whitney was in the news recently for its encouragement to teenagers to take selfies in their Jeff Wall exhibition. It was made for selfies, they implored. Beyonce and Jay-Z recently selfied or personal assistant selfied their way through the Louvre. Dealers are under increased pressure to mount shows that appear curated without the use of actual curators, inspired by the prestigious examples of spaces like London's White Cube or New York's David Zwirner and Gagosian galleries, whose shows can, in their sophistication, rival those of museums and galleries. Public galleries, I should say. The art viewer now not only wants to add social media to their experiences, but also the art fair, where we are now, a place to see and be seen. The paradox here is readily apparent. Art fairs are commercial, with booths typically mounted in a manner of days and hung salon style. Art fairs are physically and visually busy. In recent years, however, inspired by the constantly evolving experiential or user-oriented models of Art Basel Miami, and Frieze, art fairs are becoming curated. But how could an art fair, for some people a behemoth trade show by any other name, be curated? We are experiencing it presently, right at this very moment, as we are at a panel discussion in the symposia style of a European Kunsthalle, which is now standard practice at art fairs. We experience it elsewhere at Art Toronto, with, for instance, artist projects. This year by, among others, BGL, versus, Marmon and Borens, and one of my panelists here today, Thrush Holmes. And to acknowledge another fair happening at the same time, Feature Art Fair, just down the street, a more consciously curated iteration of the art fair, with just 20 exhibitors selected by a jury of curators, with each gallerist showing only between 2 to 4 artists. Feature is by no means alone in its gambit. the art fair has become, or at least aspires to the appearance of having become, an exhibition space as well as a commercial one. So in today's panel, my guests and I discuss the dimensions of all of this, the curated market, as I call it. Is this application of curating to so many aspects of the art world in 2014 merely a way to gesture towards value, to give an appearance of content or concept where it doesn't exist, where it may not exist, where it perhaps even can't exist? Or is it a needful step forward for the art world, a move towards clarity in an art world that now has more artists, more galleries, and more general noise than ever before? So I'm going to introduce my panelists here today. To my immediate left is Stefan Hancherow, who is a collector and curator. To his left is Elena Soboleva, who is a specialist, did I pronounce it wrong?
No, it's perfect.
Who is a specialist at artsy.net. And to her left is artist Thrush Holmes. So now I'm going to sit down. Thanks for joining me. So I think we should just start by having each of you tell the audience what your relationship is to curating, and then we'll go into the nitty-gritty. So we can start with Stefan.
Okay. Hello, thanks for having me. I went to NASCAD University in 2004 to train to be an artist. And when I was there, I found myself getting involved in more than just art making. I was on student union, things of that sort, and that really brought to my attention my ability to navigate the bureaucratic world, especially within an art school. That slowly evolved into me working at an university art gallery where I was installing art, and slowly I became a curator. It just kind of happened. It was something I was good at. I work with artists. I love art. It's really why I collect. It's why I do what I do, and it's really just a passion for contemporary work. Yeah.
Great. So how did you get into curating after the interest was sparked?
I would say it's really just opportunities. So when I was working in Halifax, there was at an art gallery called Mount St. Vincent University Art Gallery, there was a spot in the library where there was no art being shown. We had collection pieces in there, but it was kind of vitrine space. So I took it upon myself, and I had an idea where we would commission artists to make work using old books from the university's collection, and they would tear apart the books and do whatever they needed to do with the books and make a whole new artwork. And it was really kind of that first spark of curating, like in an actual sense. And then my boss at the time, or who's still there, Ingrid Jenkner, was very good at fostering that dialogue and let me do a couple of other exhibitions at the gallery. And I have another one coming up in the summer of 2015. So
Great. And just one more thing. You collect art as well.
Yep.
And when did that start to happen?
That happened in art school. Really, it was like trading art with friends at first. And then when I was in a more professional setting, we'd be largely collecting artists that we had engaged with, that we'd worked with, that were at a very young, emerging age, like even long before they ever had representation. So it was really just a way to extend that support to our community and really engage in it. So our collection is not necessarily under a theme. With my partner, Jen Semitis, it's really a history of the communities and the relationships with artists that we've had over the last 10 years.
Great. So you would make you would say that there is a connection then between your curatorial work and your collecting work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And it's there's works that are in the collection from artists that I have curated, and there are obviously some maybe issues that arise with that, but it's something that I am very aware of, and it's really collecting as the extension of that support. So it's really doing it all for art. To get artists paid is really the motto I have.
Great. So Elena, what's your relationship to curating?
Well, I always had a more commercial angle to curating, and I studied economics and art history. I worked with Georgia Sherman for a little bit here, and then with Jack Shaman, and so through the galleries, I started to be more involved with artists and more like helping them, build their shows. So for me, a significant point was working with Michael Snow in his 2012 show and really seeing how the role of a gallerist, and I wouldn't call it curator, but a gallerist really influenced that, and in the way of both selecting pieces, getting it all organized, whatnot. And right now I work with Artsy as a specialist. I work with a lot of the more curatorial programs, I would call them, and emerging artists. So while Artsy has about 2,000 galleries and many museums that are online, one of my roles is to make sure that for every David Zwirner and Gagosian and Victoria Miro that we also have the space in Red Hook and the cool gallery in Bushwick and this alternative space in Berlin. So it's for me, that's sort of my engagement with curatorial practice, is that I like finding sort of more emerging programs to be represented on Artsy and working on features like in the studios.
Great. Can you maybe just explain for people who aren't familiar with what Artsy is, what it is and what it does?
Sure. Artsy is an online platform, and we work with galleries, institutions, museums to bring the entire art world online. We kind of we aspire to be the architecture of the art world online. We work with about 30 fairs, including Art Toronto. And for Art Toronto, we've brought the whole preview of the fair, about 2,000 works that you can see a week in advance. So it's something that before VIP collectors would have access to certain previews. And you'd have to be really in the know and know the dealer to get that. And Artsy's been able to democratize that and bring sort of this information sharing to everyone. So we've worked with art fairs from Miami Basel to Armory to, of course, more foreign ones like Art Stage Singapore and Art Brussels, which has been really interesting. So for fairs, you can see the whole preview online. For galleries, you can actually see their current exhibition programs. You can follow artists, and the whole thing is underpinned by the Art Genome Project, which is a search functionality that's based that when artworks have a DNA structure, basically, that assimilates them together.
Yeah. So it is really, there is this very contemporary digital iteration of curation at work in Artsy, in what Artsy does. Would you say that's right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it really speaks to what you were talking about, the sort of the new age of the internet, when everyone is sort of a curator. And at Artsy, we generally, of course, have an editorial layer, and people like myself who sort of try to guide the vision of the artworks that are, shown and artists that are highlighted on the site. However, at Artsy, we also do believe that, you should be able to go on there, and if you're looking for the Rosetta Stone, you will find it on Artsy. If you're looking for Renaissance paintings, you will find it on Artsy. They're not for sale, but you will find them and learn about them. If you're looking for the Stillhouse group, you will also find that on Artsy and possibly for sale.
Great. Okay, so moving on to Thrush. You're an artist, but what is your relationship with curators and curating been?
I think I try to assert myself as much as possible with respect to curating my own shows, the presentation of my work. I've had a long history of that to a fault, I think. I have a reputation for representing myself in an overt way. It's really because my interest is in presentation and controlling that dialogue. So I don't know that I would call myself a curator, but I like to control a bit of my fate.
Yeah, certainly. So do you still have Thrush Holmes Empire, or does it no longer exist?
The public studio known as that, it closed a few years ago, so now my studio's private.
Okay. But the year span of that was what?
It was 5 years.
5 years, okay.
For 3 years I was open, and then for 2 years I avoided people, and I was not open at all, by chance.
Okay. Great. So moving on to the art fair, I'm assuming that you've all been to many art fairs. So maybe we could start by having you guys. We don't have to do a duck duck goose thing for the whole panel. But does anyone want to speak to maybe what some recent experiences you've had at art fairs in terms of what you think the best of an art fair can be, and maybe what the worst of an art fair can be? Anyone want to jump in, or else I'm going to start naming names.
I'm happy to speak to that. Like I said, I don't think that, I think at every art fair you find really great moments, and you're lucky if you come out of an art fair and you've discovered some great artists and seen things that have changed your own perspective, and that you come back and you're like, wow, I want to go back and research a whole bunch of things. So I certainly, for me, I think that I like that people attempt to curate certain aspects of a fair, because, and I then, like to be able to take from those experiences and judge it whether that was successful or not. I do believe that it makes for a nice break when you're seeing a lot of booth to come across something like at last year's Frieze New York, you have the Dan Vo installation that is suddenly, it's Marion Goodman's booth is strung up on the ceiling. And it just makes for such a break and such something completely refreshing that catches you off guard, or to find a performance piece when done well, again, by Tino Segal in a booth is really quite incredible.
Anybody else want to speak to maybe that specifically, the increased incidences of sort of more curated work in the context of an art fair? Either an example that you can think of that you've seen, or just your general preliminary opinions on how well that works.
Sure.
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. I think that an art fair is flawed from the beginning, in that the presentation is so difficult and watered down. So it's a difficult thing to curate, because it's an uncontrolled environment. You can't have control over your neighbors, what sits beside a piece or across from a booth. Beyond that, there are lighting issues. There's spatial issues. The walls are white, but they're pretty terrible. They're broken up and they're taped. The seams are taped. It's sort of a haiku of an artist's work. It's a synopsis of work by one particular artist. So I think that when a gallery seeks to focus on one or two artists, I think you alluded to this earlier, in a booth, it's often more successful than having this watered down display of 6 or 7 or 10, and it becomes a bit of a meat market. So I think that's when galleries can fail in this scenario, when they don't consider the full presentation and how it is being received.
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up an interesting point in that it's probably important just to reinforce that, because I mean, it's hard to, and I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a market expert, but you can surmise that because art fairs have become more presentational recently, it's not a coincidence that art fairs have become one of the primary places in which galleries do business. So there's that question then between, when does curating become an expression of the commercial? Is curating always an expression of the commercial? How do you draw the line there? Can we? Should we? Stefan, you were saying initially that you had this kind of more of an old school contemporary curatorial sentiment, in that you're dedicated to artists. We have these great models from the conceptualist moment of the 1960s, 1970s of these curators who are dedicated, who are giving their lives, giving everything, all of their money to support work that is incredibly esoteric and actually in many cases under attack. So it's funny to make the association between that moment and this new moment, this sort of millennial moment of using the curatorial, as a commercial gesture. So what about you? Like when you go to these new curated art fairs, like where do you place yourself?
A fan of art.
Yeah.
Is really where it comes down to its support. There's gallerists there. I really try to go to as many exhibitions in Toronto as possible. It's part of what I think a curator's duty is to really engage in the community and see artist-run center shows, the commercial shows, the museum shows, and the shows that are on the closets in the street and all of those things. That's fun. I really enjoy that. With the fairs, it's, I always find that the gallerists are incredibly capable of putting together excellent booths. And yes, there's curated projects that are around, and they can be interesting and, it's rewarding in a lot of ways. But I actually find a lot of reward when a gallerist is really putting up something that's pushing maybe their own reputation or pushing the confines of a booth. I think Nada Fair just this last year, they have these great little closet-sized booths for usually smaller galleries, and they were really, really ambitious. A lot of the galleries were really ambitious in it. So one was built up into the rafters over top, kind of, Versus is doing that this year in a really great way. And one of them had a painting that was the biggest painting you could fit inside of this little closet, just barely reaching the edge. And I thought that was successful. It really, it's this tiny thing. They probably have to pay a lot of money for it, but they rose to the opportunity. So I like those moments.
Elena, maybe do you have some insight for us in terms of the financial dynamics behind, maybe anyone does here, the financial dynamics behind gallerists approaching the art fair in a more of an exhibition style manner? Because obviously you need money to put these shows on. So then it comes down to, so money is obviously apparent, it's being exchanged, but there's this new idea of investment, of what it means to invest in art. And I'm wondering if maybe you can, because you're more of you work more with the market than I do. I'm a critic. But maybe you can speak to this change that sort of seems to have happened over the last 5-10 years, where there's been this willingness on the part of commercial galleries to invest in an exhibition or arguably a curatorial context, even within art fairs.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting. I mean, to give you a rough idea, the report that's released every year about art fairs and in general states that right now galleries make about 30% of their sales through an art fair. So it's a really, really important driver. And generally in the market, we see more and more galleries feeling the need to participate in fairs. It is the new way that galleries are getting collectors, clients activated. And so instead of actually many galleries thinking about opening spaces or trying to, connect with collectors the old-fashioned way, now art fairs are the new mode, especially to enter new markets that they want to penetrate. That goes very well with the online because that's the extension of the art fair, of course, to them. And to talk about the sort of interesting investment aspect, I mean, we're seeing generally more and more galleries realizing that what they present at an art fair in this very curated sense sometimes can be more successful if it's one single work that is a museum piece. And I think Basel speaks the best to this with their features section, and galleries such as, really esteemed Brussels space Xavier Hufkens bringing Sterling Ruby or Harold Ankart. And those pieces by those artists only a museum could afford or ever place because the size and scale of a single piece occupies the entirety of the sort of enormous booth. And yet, by investing in that, by having the elite art world see that, appreciate that, Instagram that, all of a sudden you're creating a dynamic where those same artists, of course, are then the most in demand. And suddenly the dealer is able to, sell off an iPad to the people they want, and you're suddenly seeing the sort of rise in their markets in the evening auctions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really like about that particular initiative of Art Basel is that even though, and also that NATA initiative that you talked about, is that even though there are portioned off spaces, there's still, I mean, I like the cacophony of the art fair a little bit. Like, it's kind of part of the art fair experience, right?
The Independent is great for that as well,
Yeah,
where they have no
Independent.
walls. It's,
Yeah. So in something like Independent, there is, even though there are managed and sort of contained aesthetics within the fair, there's still noise going on. There's still that kind of, you hear the noise of the art market, which is kind of an interesting thing to experience when you go to any art fair. One of my questions, though, is to go to something like the Untitled Fair in Miami last year, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and it's not like Untitled is alone in this, but they had one curator who was in charge of Omar Lopez Chahoud, I think his name is, and he was in charge of basically selecting all of the galleries and then advising the galleries in terms of which artists they showed. Now, some gallerists I talked to at Untitled said that he was very hands-off, and some gallerists said he wasn't. But you do walk into an art fair like that, and you can sense the hand of one individual, almost in like a totalitarian manner, the hand of one individual affecting, like, sort of, wiping across the entire fair. And that's something that I visited the Feature Art Fair today, and one of the things, it's very beautifully presented, but one of the things that I wondered, and it's not, Feature isn't the result of one curator, it's the result of a curatorial jury. But one of the things that I wondered, because a lot of the work looks the same, there's a lot of kind of, renaissance of the modernist object, blah, blah, blah. Maybe there's such a thing as too much curation in an art fair, where if it's so curated, everything starts looking the same, and actually the work becomes as indistinguishable as the old school salon style kind of, trade show model. I'm wondering if any of you guys have any opinions on that, if it's possible to go too far in curating.
I agree with you, and I think there's a point where it becomes pretentious very early. And the nice thing about the mess of a fair like this is that it's completely unpretentious, and that's why it's so accessible to people. I don't know that one curator should be able to wash his hand over an entire convention center or other venue. So I like the idea of some restriction. I think, but it should be limited. Untitled was a successful fair, I think, because it did have some limitations.
Anybody else want to speak to that?
Well, I'll add that Untitled was launched recently, so I think for the fact that they're entering a saturated market of Miami during the time, they really had to make sure that something was presentable and good, and so for that reason, I think I would say it was wise to go with one vision, and I think as hopefully organically it can take on its own form much more. I think that also the point you made that over-curation within each booth doesn't always add up to the sum of something greater, and I think that's where I definitely would agree to that, and I think that's where it's important to insert solo booths with artists, and I think that's something that is a really strong element to have at any fair. I know NATA tries to do that. I know that the Independent actually, I think in a week, November 6th or something, is opening a whole new fair in New York of just solo projects where you're going to have everyone from Perez Projects, Berlin, to Gagosian and Zwerner presenting one single artist in the space where the Independent shows during the spring. I think that'll be very interesting to see as well. So when the sort of organization is able to pick artists that they want to present rather than necessarily entire programs, I think it ends up being a very very good experience for the viewer, but probably a tougher one for the galleries, since if it's not completely commercial, it's tougher to make to make it worthwhile.
Yeah.
But I think in the end, it's comparable to an art forum campaign. But it is, and the reach is wider because people are taking photos of it and posting them on the internet. So I think while the benefits can't be immediately realized in the short term, over the course of time, they become meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's baffling to me, is just that there's all of this investment in such intangible returns in the art world, increasingly so.
I think they're much more tangible now with the quick reaction of the market.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, obviously it wouldn't happen if there weren't some tangibility to them. Stefan, I want to get your opinion maybe on this. Is it possible to over-curate a fair?
I think you can over-curate anything.
Yeah.
It's really just scope. We were joking before just about, we're talking about this imagery that's going up while we speak, but just being a ghost. I said, if you're going to draw me, make me the little emoji ghost. Because just as a curator, it's really, I'm kind of more old school, I guess, in that regard. It's my influences, but to just kind of let things be. I love when artists kind of push the limits a bit, but you can always over-curate something. I'm interested in how you said, like how fast the art market's moving, and I think sometimes it's too quick. I know there's been a lot of discussion over the resale of artists, and someone just told me today of an artist whose work sold for, hundred thousands of dollars on a resale, and it was baffling to me again. It's always kind of baffling when I hear it, but I think maybe the market moves too fast too. You can over-curate. The market's going so fast, everybody's maybe doing it too much, but that's fine.
Yeah. I wanted to ask then, in terms of, here at the fair, there are a lot of installations, artist installations, that could take the function of an exhibition that you might see in a public gallery or a museum. And I guess my question to you guys would be, is there a limit to a quote-unquote exhibition experience that can occur within the context of a fair? Or are we seeing those lines being increasingly blurred? Are we going to, start hearing people talk about an exhibition that they saw, at Art Basel Miami versus an exhibition that they saw at the New Museum, or in the same vein, or is that what we're moving towards? And as a critic, I find it very interesting because we're at this tipping point as critics where we see art viewers wanting to go to fairs. There's a hunger to go to fairs, and dealers obviously have been feeling this for years. It's becoming almost exponential, but as critics, we struggle to write about art fairs. Like, there's only a certain amount of things we can say about what an art fair does and what's showing at an art fair, because we're used to looking for, for lack of a better word, we're used to looking at curated work, whether it's curated by a commercial gallerist or whether it's curated by an actual curator at a museum or public gallery. So for me, and I think a lot of my colleagues, it feels like this programming of increasing the art installations at an art fair is a bit of a calling to critics to come write about something that's a little bit more substantial. And I'm just wondering I'm wondering if you have any opinions on that. Like, to go back to my original question, is there a limit to one's exhibition experience at an art fair, or are we in a moment where art fairs are serious contenders as exhibition spaces alongside the more sort of traditional or respected ones?
I'll start with that one. I don't think art fairs need to go to that museum zone, essentially, or to be an exhibition. It's a market. It's always going to be a market. I think critics have a tough time writing about it because it's instilled in the market. I'm when you asked a few questions beforehand, I wrote that as a curator, I'm more interested in seeing what institutions are collecting. And I think that's where the exhibition occurs. So the AGO comes and buys, 5, 6 works in about 6 months, maybe even 3 months. You're going to see them up at the AGO in a show. That's the kind of museological excitement that I get from a fair. And I think there's a lot you could, as a critic, write about it, because it's an institution who's putting their taste in a public forum, and they are making you very aware that they're purchasing them. So that's, I think that's the role of the fair, for it to become more of a non-commercial museum show. Then it's no longer a fair, and what are we doing anymore? So it's not broken, I would say.
I think it's case by case. Every fair is different, and the context in Toronto or in Canada is just, it's fucked up. So we need some help, and I think that's why, that's why there's this emergence of other fairs like Feature, to draw critics' interest, and also to engage people a little more. I mean, it's a little too accessible at times, and it's underwhelming and overwhelming at the same time, but for the wrong reasons. So I think that some fairs just need some life into them, like just inserted, rammed into their programming. I think it's important, and some can hold back a little bit, but there is a delicate balance, I think.
Elena?
Well, I think a balance is certainly the right word, but I think what you said about being curator bait, bait for critics
Yeah.
when you curate is really interesting. And one thing I noticed in the last week, I wasn't at Frieze, but my colleagues and everyone who was, the only reports I was getting was the Helena Mod booth. At Frieze Masters, there was one gallerist who created a booth that was the apartment of a collector, with old magazines, newspapers. Basically, it's been lived in. So a space taken over that someone had lived in, and then put up paintings. And that was the most predominantly reported on booth in the whole Frieze week, I would say. So it's certainly, when people execute it well, I think it certainly achieves the goal. It gives people something to remember. It obviously causes a lot of media attention, whether good or bad. It does work that way.
Okay.
And that was a gallerist, not a curator, doing that, though. So that's something I brought up earlier, is gallerists are very capable of that.
So then I guess a segue, maybe slightly away from the art fair, are we, and Thrush, you were talking about this when you introduced yourself, but are we in a moment now where curating has become so mainstream, so widespread that it's just an important skill for everyone involved in the art world to have? And if it is, like, could it be broken down? Because I think one of the things about curating is how easily mystified it is. People sort of don't, we know that curators are powerful figures, but we don't quite know what they do, and we don't quite know how they do it. But we know that they function as arbiters in some way. So now that it's becoming more democratized, how important or unimportant is it for us to all kind of adopt a curatorial sensibility in the art world? And if it is important, what would that entail?
I can speak from the perspective of an artist that we are the worst editors of work, because we're so our relationship with the work is so intimate. So if we are able to manage that flaw that we all have, then it can be quite powerful. It is also necessary, I think, to push back a little bit, because there's always pressure from dealers and curators to show work that might be against what it is that you want to show, especially when there's a market established for that work.
Well, I would say that certainly coming from the digital realm, and the online has really made everyone a curator, and not to say it's made everyone a good curator, but it's empowered people to have a voice and an opinion and be very much in dialogue. And so no longer do you have people who are these sort of very much high up figures who dictate sort of taste. All of a sudden there is sort of a crowdsourcing and a general trend making that happens organically. And I think that's really interesting, and I think that's being paid attention to, that, you know, it's no longer the single individual, but sort of a collective voice.
I would just add that if people are labeling something as it has been curated, I would then assume that they've considered at somewhat great length, maybe not much, but they've really considered what they've put forward. And if people are spending more time and considering what they're putting out, either online or in public, that's a good thing. So
I think it's interesting to that point. It's interesting to have an intermediary because someone needs to be not financially tied to the project. A gallerist is, and so is the artist, invariably. So I think that having someone separate is a very healthy thing.
So do any of you, we've actually, I think it's been a fairly positive panel, but does anybody want to talk about some of the fears that they have around, you know, the faddishness that the curated is often associated with? Is there a way in which it goes too far? I guess sort of a double-barrel question then. Both what are the negative aspects of curating kind of becoming one of the dominant modes of understanding the art, presenting the art market? What are the negative ways? And then also conversely, what are the needful ways in which curating can function? Because curating for so many years has just been sort of seen as this kind of conceptual act, and I guess before the conceptualist moment, it was seen in a more needful way as kind of like a really specific sort of librarian-like task. So I guess maybe we can wrap it up because we're nearing close to the end of the hour. But if you could just maybe speak to things about the obsession with the curatorial that irritates you, and then the things that you find are just like absolutely necessary about the curatorial.
I find myself once a week asking myself what the fuck a curator is and what am I doing. It's baffling to me in some cases. So I have to then, reach that point, and then I come back and I love it again. It's a battle. Curating is, yes, it's become kind of a fad, a buzzword. That's fine. It's still, I still do my curatorial work. There's good curators, there's bad curators, there's good artists, there's bad artists. Just because you call yourself a curator doesn't make you one. There's all these things, but I'm not really one to just tell you to stop doing that. So it's fine. I struggle with it weekly, seriously.
I guess, I do agree with you that the word itself is far overused in every context, from fashion to your dinner menu. So it's one of those things that I think has just entered the common lexicon, basically. But as far as what I think kind of where it needs to be, I think that there is sort of a great desire to have to still find these visionary curators like Klaus Biesenbach, like Zeman of the 69 exhibition, because we still need people who are going to actually push the artists to do something greater. The curator and the artist in the very pure form is something that creates for great movements in art and great moments in art history. And so I think there's still, I hope that there's still curators out there who really are visionary and push things to new heights.
I think everyone wants to see behind the curtain, and it's important to protect that, because otherwise we are inundated with imagery. So curators are important for that, for sort of managing that voice. It's a loaded title, not unlike critic. What is a good critic and what's bad? It comes down to taste and who is trustworthy and who isn't. So it is a necessary thing, but it can be a necessary evil at times, depending on, I suppose, the willingness to be open to suggestion from artists and from dealers, but more really for artists, because oftentimes there are real difficulty in being able to express one's voice properly.
Yeah, and I recently interviewed Simon Starling for the magazine, and he was talking about how this new survey of his work that just that was just in Chicago over the summer and then is coming to Montreal in the winter. It was really Dieter Rollstratte at the MCA who encouraged him to show his work, show the objects that he was working with, and make it an object-oriented, sort of sculpture-oriented show. And he said that would never have occurred to him to do, but he was happy that it had happened. And I thought that was interesting because, in my book, I do a lot of arguing about curating as not only the impartation of value, but sort of an anxious performance of value. And I see a lot of anxiety in contemporary curating, where it's coming from, I think, in the art market, it's coming from, the art market is inherently volatile. So, the fact that there's a lot of curating going on in the art market might suggest that volatility and might suggest an attempt to sort of tamp it down. But then there's the other side of curating where the curator helps and facilitates and kind of steps back and allows a voice to come out.
I go by that as all the time. It's trust. I really try to begin with and establish trust between an artist and myself. And if there's trust there, shows change, things change constantly when you're curating. And if there's trust there, you can let it go. You don't have to worry about that person, screwing it up or anything like that.
Great. So maybe we'll just open it up to some questions. We have about 10 minutes left. Anybody with any questions?
I don't think your microphone's on.
They got too sophisticated, too caught up with curatorial, too caught up with themselves. I think the purpose of an art fair, I started in 1980 at the Columbus Center in New York, and I met, personally, I grew up, I studied art. I grew up worshiping Irritates, Peter Max, and all these people that I would never have met in a million years until I went to a trade show and I met them. And they're just people like us, okay? And when you see their work, I think everybody's getting too caught up with all this sort of commercialism. Read a book by Don Thompson called The $12 Million Shark. You'll find out the history of art. You'll find out the purpose of the auctions, the purpose. It's all, the digital world is phenomenal to inform the public. The purpose of a show is to introduce a wider audience to the galleries, the dealers, and who they represent, the artists. And it gets too caught up with all the politics and sophistication and the costs and all this stuff, which really doesn't matter because it's the public that are buying the works. And you're introducing an enormous amount of artists, and especially Canada, we're way behind the States. Like Jeff Wall, people were buying Jeff Wall. They were buying Ed Bratinsky here for $5,000 10 years ago. Now he's up to $45,000. So how do you get a public to come meet the dealers? And I think these shows, I've been documenting these shows from the 5th anniversary, 10th anniversary, and I think there's an amazing intimacy between the galleries, and I think there's most importance, it's reaching an audience. We've never had such a tremendous audience in the arts. Canada's catching up to the rest of the world, and then we're going to all the shows, our dealers are going to all the shows, and they're bringing Canadian artists who nobody would have ever heard of, because our publications don't really get out to the world. Canada is the only country in the world that's not in Taschen, not in Payton. There's no books. There's a history of art, the 21st century. There's nothing about Canada except for Riopelle. But he spent his life in Paris. And the whole thing, his biggest success, the same thing with Jack Bush. They sold for over $1 million in the 70s. And this is it. The shows are the most important way to reach an audience and teach them to go to galleries, because the only way you can learn about art is go to the galleries.
Well, the idea of curating, like the contemporary use of the word curate is very much geared towards the presence of an audience. So what you're saying is really interesting to me, because you're saying that an art fair, please correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but to me, it seems as if you're saying that an art fair is about interacting with an art viewership and an art buyership. And there's an intimacy to that interaction that happens in the context of an art fair that maybe doesn't happen in other aspects of the art fair. And what you imply in your statement about the curated art fair is interesting, because when you curate an art fair, you also try to draw an audience, right? We have a project by BGL, a big carousel made out of crowd barriers, right? That's a way to attract an audience. People will be taking photographs on the carousel, posting them on Facebook, posting them on Instagram. But the kind of interaction that you're talking about is very different. Is very different. It's more of a kind of speaking to a human being who's made the artwork, speaking to a human being who represents the artist and who knows about the artist. So I think there's a counterpoint to be thought of there, and I think you bring up some really interesting ideas. In terms of the idea of the art fair as something that engages an art viewer, and maybe how that's changed.
I think my friend has got the right idea, and some of the discussion earlier on was sort of like, well, why aren't art fairs like the Rothko Chapel, where you can kind of interact with the art in some way? But I think that's not what it's about. It's about interaction with people, and exposure to discovery of things that you haven't discovered. The notion of curating is interesting because it's not one thing. In the context of an art market, it seems to be a marketing ploy. Rather than, let's say, discovery of some kind of depth that's going to take me someplace. And I think the other thing I would like to kind of point out is the question of a booth with one artist in it seems to me to be actually destructive, because it elevates super artists, and then the halo that super artist comes across the super gallery. So therefore, it's about elevating the market value rather than necessarily delivering true experiences or allowing a wider group of artists to connect with the market and audience. So.
Maybe I can talk to that.
Yes.
Why I think it's why I feel it is actually important. And I think your point is very valid, that there is a sort of a super artist, super curator, that we all elevate and the market praises. But very much to the point of, working in a New York context, I see amazing Canadian artists that are not necessarily even recognized in Canada. Young people like Elaine Cameron-Weir and Ben Schumacher and Brett Wadden and Ryan Forrester, who is here. And they're all great folks that don't have that sort of necessarily pull here, and to appreciate them, and for art fairs to have a significant international influence. When an audience member is exposed to one work, they don't necessarily get a representation. So if you're only going to be in an area and see a booth of a solo presentation of an artist as an audience member, it is a much better representation of an artist's practice. And maybe the artist will not get the museum show until a couple decades after, but seeing the solo presentation, if you were not to make it to where the artist usually shows, it gives you that much greater engagement, and hopefully then causes you further, reason to go and explore the work.
I just wonder about all of this curating, though. Like, where is the trust for the viewer? Like, where is the trust for the viewer's ability to curate and parse the visual information that she or he is presented with? And I feel like there's kind of this over facilitation sometimes that those that sort of mono artist booths can affect, where it's just kind of like, I can handle, like, I feel like as at least as a person who likes art, I can handle a busy salon style hang in a booth of a gallery that I love, because I want to see a lot of work. I want to see all of the people they represent, you know, and maybe we're losing that. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
I guess so, but I mean, when doing tours, it's so hard to take someone and show them a BGL picture or photograph, and then I have to give them this great context of, you know, well, actually they do performance and installation. It's great to have the carousel here to take people too, but in reality, you know, it's really, I think you need both, because I agree it's wonderful for someone who's knowledgeable already to see the, you know, advances, but then to try to educate someone on the artwork of a new artist, or, you know, an artist they're not familiar with, through a piece that you need to have all the other context for, is very difficult.
Any other questions? Oh, go.
Does curating turn the audience into passive consumers, and it's just part of the consumption structure of society?
I have so much to say on that topic.
Oh, sorry.
I wrote a book on it. I think that, yeah, partially yes. I think, but I mean, we all love that. We all love that things can be curated, and in fact, what I was trying to get to with my question about how needful is curating. Is curating a want, or is it a need? And I think maybe back in the day, I mean, the amount of commercial galleries in you know, the developed world has grown so exponentially to the point of it boggles the mind. The amount of aspiring artists has grown so exponentially that it boggles the mind. And now we're presented, you know, for the past 20 years, we've presented with this thing called the internet, which also boggles the mind with all of its content. So it kind of makes you into a bit of a wet noodle. All of this stimuli makes you into a bit of a wet noodle, to the point where you want you want somebody to curate it for you. Like, you want the explorer who's going to go into the trenches and pick things up and present them to you. But there's a price that we pay for that kind of passivity that has all been thrust upon us, right? And I think we're at an important crossroads where we've discovered, we've become aware of how passive we've been made by these curatorial models, and now it's up to us to decide if we also want to become curators, and that's happening. But are we doing it in a qualitative way? Are we doing it in a useful way? Are we doing it in a way that's empowering? That remains to be seen. But it's a very good question, and I think there's a definite connection between the curated and the passive, unquestionably. Anybody else?
I just sometimes wonder if the act of curating has just become a fundamentally anxious act in fundamentally anxious times. It's just, there's such an anxious need to put things in a place when there are so many things. So it's just become an anxious act.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically like that's basically the thesis of my book. But in a way, it's not a thesis. It's just a statement. It's just an observation as to what's happening. And I think maybe just more people need to be aware that is happening. Like, you can't actually, you know, we were talking about the art market. Like, the art market's it's always been very anxious. You know, there's a lot of money in the art market. It's not going to like implode anytime soon, but it's still a bit anxious. It's an anxious place to be in. So obviously curating would become part of more aspects of the contemporary art market, the more anxious it is. But I guess maybe I want to make it clear that I'm not casting aspersions on the idea of the curatorial, but yeah, it's more of an observation that, or perhaps in answer to the question, where does this curatorial impulse come from? Where does this compulsion to curate come from? Well, it speaks to larger conditions in our society, for sure. I mean, I agree with you 100%. Did anybody else have anything to say about that?
It's a futile act, but I think we need to have things organized for us just because there are so many things. It's like someone making you a playlist. we appreciate those things now because it's just difficult to navigate when there's just so much accessible.
I have a question. You spoke to the digital realm. We're kind of in the internet right now. How do you, at Artsy, engage with art that is virtual or digital or net-based?
Well, I'm personally very interested in it. At Artsy, we engage with it much like we engage with art that is installation or performance or anything else. It's contemporary art. We want to be able to represent it. We want to be able to educate people and help people discover it. So for artists like Rosendahl, who does web and websites basically at his works, what we can offer is some still images and a link because we're not going to try to replicate the artwork. We work with Rhizone and 7x7, which of course John Raffman has participated in the past. We recognize it's a really interesting force, and we try our best to present it. And I think it's also to talk about a little bit your point of the playlist. I love that because in some ways, Artsy's mission is to make art as ubiquitous as music, and the idea that you can go and create your own playlist of art is very much at the core of what we'd love everyone to be able to do. So.
And I think one of the main tasks of the curator has always been, even within the conceptual art world in the 60s and 70s, was actually, even though they were dealing with the dematerialization of the art object, a lot of the curators, their responsibility was in some way to materialize that dematerialized work. So to advocate for it with material, with printed objects. For example, Seth Siegelub, I write in my book about Seth Siegelub's relationship with Robert Barry and his Inner Gas series, making things concrete. And so in that sense, Artsy is very much a curatorial project in terms of materializing a variety of artists' works, a variety of artist practice. And you can define materialize in a number of ways, right? But that's certainly, I think, one of the main tasks always has been of the contemporary curator. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm just wondering, how do curators establish a criteria to curate? So, for example, at Artsy, where you have so much variety, how do you decide what is going to be excluded, and how do you create consistency among all of you who are selecting?
Well, we don't select artists ourselves. So what we do is we work with galleries, and we try to create the best representation of the area. So if that's very much how we work with art fairs as well. So we have about 30 different fairs we work with, and the idea is we work with, the fairs that represent and are the best representation of the different geographies. So for Russia, it'll be Cosmosco. For Canada, Art Toronto, and for in New York, we have to cover a couple, but and so we leave, in some ways, we work within already the existing structures of the art world, and we want to be able to present the galleries that are both, the blue chip spaces, the emerging spaces of Nada, and even, ones that are younger. We want to be able to present spaces that, are more regional and show artworks by artists within certain, Arizona or Kentucky or other geographical distributions. And so for us, it's sort of, we leave it in the hands of the people who actually know it best, and we try to, much like an art fair, recruit the galleries that we want to work with and want to have them represent the programs. And then we don't control, once we have a gallery on the platform or a fair, we actually don't control beyond that point, and they put the artists on.
Do we have to wrap it up, or do we have one more question? One more question?
There was one girl over there that had her hand up really early too, but yeah, go ahead.
Hey guys, great panel, by the way. My name's David. I'm from Calgary. I came all the way to Toronto for the art fair. And actually, I'm a newbie collector. I don't have a lot of pieces. I can't afford a lot. And someone who doesn't have an art history degree or anything like that. I just would like to say I appreciate curators. I appreciate curating to help guys like me who don't get most of it to understand it, right? I just discovered Artsy, believe it or not. I'm sorry, I should have discovered it a long time ago, but I love it. I'm also online a lot, so I appreciate that. My question is where's the future of curating going? A lot of people here are existing collectors. You've done this for a long time, but the next generation of collectors is going to look at curating in a whole new way, right? They're going to be asking friends, family, going online, looking at professional curating, going to galleries, going to fairs. What do you see, maybe all three of you, even the artists, Thrush, what would you like to see, right? So future of curating.
It would be done from outer space. I have no idea what the future will hold. I have no idea. I can't speak to that. I have no idea. I have no even interest in what that would mean. I'm just like a present day kind of guy. Maybe these other people can enlighten you.
I don't know. My best prediction would be somewhere between sort of digital realms and also actually artists are doing really cool things. A lot of the stuff that I see that is really I'm very engaged with is when artists curate their friends, because that exposes me to sort of artists that I wouldn't have otherwise maybe come across. Or so I'm always really interested in shows that are curated by artists and for artists, because I think they have a very pure reason for it often.
Thanks for your question. First, want to say, excited to have you here. You don't need a lot of money to collect art. Jen and I are a great example of that. So it's really a pleasure to have more people kind of take that plunge. Future of curating. I don't know if it's really going to change as much as we think, to be honest. It's really, even from the onset, been about that trust and that fostering of a relationship and really, the goal to get that artist to make even more work and better work. And with that, you need to be in shows, you need to be getting paid to be in shows, and you need to have that that support network. I would see the biggest change coming in with the way that the professionalization of curating is occurring. I work at an artist-run center, and when they started up in the 70s, they were against a system. They were against the museum system. They were to allow for a contemporary avant-garde to emerge and flourish, and it was really about that support network and establishing that. Artist-run centers are now heavily bureaucratic, heavily reliant on numerous funding, corporate funding. I have to talk with corporate donors constantly. We have property, we have real issues that real galleries have. We're no longer able to run off like by the seat of our pants and do things. It's not a professional system. But I do see new things emerging. They're online. There are little pop-up galleries. 811 is a great one that's in Toronto, and they just kind of do it. And there's not really a lot of press around it. There's not really a lot of other things happening, but it just happens. And that's where I see curating, going. There's a new generation. I'm a millennial. The digital natives are going to be, exceptionally more adept to opening up what curating can be and where. I think it's more where it can be.
I would add to that and just say that I think that it was very hard to predict what's going to happen, but I think that it's probably safe to say that those huge curator figures, like those huge power curators that we've seen since the 90s, it's no longer possible really to have that much.
I disagree with you entirely.
Really?
Totally.
It's just my opinion. I mean, I see so many people, so many aspiring curators struggling to make money and struggling to find jobs, and there's more and more people graduating from curatorial studies programs wanting to work in an institutional context, making these huge kind of creative authorial moves as curators, and I just feel like there's not room, and those people came into the market at a time when, they were new, it was new.
But it's like saying there was never going to be another star artist.
I'm not saying there's never going to be another star curator. I'm just saying that those positions are going to become fewer and fewer, and we're going to see a lot more outside the box curating because more and more people are just taking it on for themselves. And also institutions are becoming more and more inhospitable to curators who just want to do something all on their own and something crazy.
Who's going to pay for it?
Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to come to the show? Institutions are making very safe choices in terms of programming, and there's no room for a curator who's not going to toe the line. So that's another reason why I think that position is dying off.
I would also slightly say that I think it's getting polarized. There's the superstar curators and the Klaus Biesenbachs who will continue to hang out with James Franco. And there's going to be the people doing their own projects and hopefully disseminating that through alternate means like online.
Are we done? I think we're done. I just want to make a shameless, vulgar plug for my own book by saying that it's for sale at the Canadian Art Booth. I'm going to be there for a while if you want to talk to me about it and if you want a copy. Thanks for coming out. I appreciate your interest. Have a good night. Have a good fair. And thank you to the panelists.